Well, it's good to see so many of you. I expected far less after last week. And by the time we get to the end of this course, it'll be just me and Catherine, and only because she has to be here. But it's so good to see you all again. And we're starting in this book of Hebrews. And Hebrews is look, I don't want to oversell it, but let me just say this. Hebrews changed my life. Maybe I'm overselling it. No, it's an extremely significant book of the Bible. And I would go so far as to say that if you don't understand Hebrews, you don't understand the Bible. It's absolutely core that we study this book. So the way we're going to approach it is this, what I've got here presented is basically a theological course that I've presented at undergraduate level and graduate level. I've taken a lot of the extra stuff out of here that would just overburden us for what we're doing. But basically we're approaching this from a scholarly point of view, and that's what makes it theological. It's like what you would get in a theological college, but also from a Christian evangelical faith perspective. So we combine the two. So a number of you have probably never sat in a theological course, and how stressful that can be. And of course, when students go the first semester, they usually all freak out because it's just not what they expected. They didn't expect to be studying the Bible in the way they do. So I'm introducing you to that a little bit because a number of people here, I believe, destined for maybe a lifetime of ministry in churches, teaching, preaching, and this could be an introduction for them, or eldership or leadership in the church. And it's very important to get some of the structures in place to help you understand how we come to understand what is in the Bible. Okay, so I'm raising the question first up, why study Hebrews at all? Well, Hebrews is actually, it's God's word. And it's one of the last of the letters that made its way into the canon of Scripture. A lot of people weren't happy about it because it was challenging things that people thought shouldn't be challenged. And I find that this attitude remains. And a lot of theologians have not shown a lot of interest in Hebrews. And even people who have taught Hebrews, I've sometimes found, have not really liked it that much. People think that it's complicated, they don't understand the Hebrews world, they don't understand the point that it's trying to make, and it seems to be counterintuitive to the way we are as humans. It seems to be teaching us something that we don't quite get. And part of the reason for that is, to understand Hebrews, you have to enter into a culture, an ancient culture, the Hebrew culture. If you talk to Jews today, they're Greeks. Basically, we're all Greeks in this room, even though probably nobody is actually a Greek, although I have some Greek background. But we're all Greek thinkers. We've all been trained in the Greek Socratic method. That when we go to university, that's how we learn, that's how we think. We start with ourselves. So we think of ourselves as the centre of knowledge, and we work our way out from there. Hebrew understanding works from a different principle altogether, and there's so many differences in it. So when people approach this from a Western perspective, or even an Africanist perspective or an Asian perspective, it's confusing because Hebrew literature is designed in a different way, and it's got a different approach to understanding knowledge. That's what we have to try to get behind. So in studying Hebrews, you actually go on a cultural expedition. You go into a different world where people think in a different way. But at the same time, it's heavily Hellenistic. It's Greek as well. There's a lot of the Greek philosophers, a lot of Platonic thinking in here that you'll come across. So it's an interesting weave of understanding. So, but primarily for us, it is the Word of God. Another reason to study this book is because it is the only full sermon that we have in the Bible. You know the Sermon on the Mount? That's not a full sermon. That's, in a sense, truncated. This is a full sermon with all the structure. So studying this is a way of coming to understand how we should preach, how we should communicate the message, how it was done in the first century, what was important and what was critical there. Interestingly, and most importantly for me, is that this is the only letter that we have in the New Testament that actually explains the Old Covenant and why it failed. You know, you maybe see, a lot of Christians today don't think that the Old Covenant system failed at all. They actually think it was a success, and even in my own Presbyterian tradition, many just think that the gospel is just a natural extension of the Old Covenant. But the Hebrews writer goes on to explain why that system broke down totally. And in fact, he says the most disparaging things about it. For instance, the law was weak and useless. The law was weak and useless. Could you imagine saying that to a Jewish audience? And yet that was the challenge that he issued from this book. So he's really taking it. A lot of people find this hard to understand, because when you read the Old Testament and you see the sacrificial system, and you see the priests, and you see the celebrations, the rituals, the bloodletting, the sacrifices, the Day of Atonement, all of that whole rigorous process. And the Hebrews says it achieved absolutely nothing. And we think, you've got to be kidding. All of that, and it got you nothing? And so that's where a lot of people look at it and think, I don't get Hebrews. I just don't get it, because it's making far too big a claim about the Old Testament. And we'll see why later. It's also the only letter that actually speaks of Jesus being a high priest. You know, if it wasn't for Hebrews, we wouldn't even understand that Jesus is a high priest. And now my main research area is the Gospel of Matthew. And we tend to think of Jesus as king. And he is that. He has all authority. All authority has been given to him. A king rules, and he rules over people who serve him. But Jesus is also a priest. And a priest is not designated to rule, but to serve, and to serve many. So gaining an understanding that Jesus is a priest is absolutely critically important. And we shouldn't be deceived by the image of priests that we have in the Bible, because priests became elitists. They became powerful. They became wealthy. They abused their privilege. But priests were never to be that. Priests were supposed to be the servants of the people. And so when Jesus came, he actually came as a priest. And that's how Hebrews introduces him, the great high priest. Everything he did was based on his priesthood. It also gives us a clear understanding of the gospel. Last week, I wanted to introduce you to some concepts of theology and what it means to be a Christian, because I think most of us still think of ourselves as individuals who have to make it. You know, have you ever seen those images of baby turtles coming out of the sand and having to go to the beach? That's how we feel like. We feel like the big turtle crawled up on the beach, laid the eggs, and that's what Jesus did. And then we have to struggle down the beach, fight off the birds, get into the water, fight off the fish, fight off the sharks. You know, they say 1 in 500 will survive or something to adulthood. And that's how we often perceive ourselves as Christians. It's like we have to bear the burden of our faith. We have to carry it. We have to push it through. To get a clear understanding of the gospel, you've got to understand very deeply the biblical idea of representation. What it means to have a representative who actually does everything on your behalf, who fully represents you, In other words, when Jesus dies on the cross, if he represents you, you died on the cross. See, if Jesus died to sin, then you have died to sin. If Jesus has been raised from the dead, because he's your representative, you too will be raised from the dead. You see, all of these direct connections are based on representation. Not your own effort, but who you're connected to, who you're one with. And that is a hard thing for Westerners to understand, because we are so driven to think of ourselves as those little turtles off trying to survive, hoping we don't get picked off. And we don't understand that we're more like the full-grown turtle that just appeared out of nowhere. So it gives us a clear understanding of the gospel and how we got here. It is also, I believe, the foundational book of the Bible. And whenever I would start at a church in the last 15 years, last 20 plus years, I would always start with Hebrews. And people would think I was mad, because normally people start with James. You know, where are you going to start? Well, let's start with James. Tell people to behave themselves and be good and to do good works and all of that. And I start with Hebrews, and people don't understand why I start with Hebrews. Because if you don't understand Hebrews, you can't understand the rest. It's as simple as that. It's really as simple as that. If you don't understand Hebrews, you can't understand the Old Testament. If you don't understand the Old Testament, you can't understand the gospel. So it's a foundational book. And as I said, anyone who understands Hebrews understands the Bible, the big, big picture of God. So let me give you an example of what this means. The Apostle Paul in Romans says that there's two types of people. There's Gentiles and there's Jews. Okay? So he says the Gentiles are all under God's condemnation, under God's wrath, because they're connected to Adam. Okay? Because we're in Adam, we're dead and destined for death. That's our inheritance. That's how we're born. That's how, from the time we're conceived, we've got death and sin at work in us. We looked at that a little bit last week. So that's Gentiles. But then he says Jews. Jews are under the law. And he says, and so they are equally condemned. He said they're both on the same position. Jews and Gentiles are both condemned. One group because they're descendants of Adam. The other group who are descendants of Abraham, who was blessed, but now they've been given a law which makes them like Gentiles again. Now, you might think, oh, well, no big mystery there. No big mystery there. But see, for a Jew who would have heard Paul in the first century, they would have said, just hold on a minute. You mean to say that we had the law, we had the patriarchs, we had the temple, we had the journey in the wilderness, we had the prophets, we had the sacrifices, we've got the devotion, we've got the worship, and we're not one bit better off than the Gentiles. You see? Now, can you see that problem? And Paul never stops to explain why the Jews are in the same situation as the Gentiles. He never stops to explain. In fact, nobody in the New Testament stops to explain until we come to Hebrews. And you'll see why shortly. So let's look at Hebrews as a great challenge. I've already mentioned in part that the Epistle to Hebrews is one of the most disliked documents in the New Testament. I actually had a lecturer in Hebrews who introduced it by saying he can't understand how anybody could like it. So that's because people can't come to terms with what it's actually saying. Its theology has been largely ignored. So when people use Hebrews, Hebrews has got the best quotes. The Word of God is sharp and active, sharper than any two-edged sword. It divides the bone from the marrow. Those sorts of things. Jesus Christ, the same, yesterday, today, and forever. It's got a range of very quotable quotes that people use all the time. And that's how they use Hebrews, to go and get little bits. But they never actually look. Most people don't look at the theology of Hebrews, what it's actually saying, why it was written, what is the main big idea that it's trying to communicate. Hebrews is also written in the highest form of Greek in the New Testament. So most of the New Testament is written in what's called Koine Greek, Common Greek. And this is also largely Common Greek, but it's also the most sophisticated form of Greek language used. It is largely considered, again, too hard to understand. And I don't believe it is. So please don't let this put you off. It is not hard to understand, but you just have to approach it from the right way. It's like if you look at Everest and you sort of see a thing and you say, we can never climb that, and somebody says, come around the back, I'll show you the way that most people get up. You think, oh, that's the way you do it. There's a way to understand this book, but if you stand on the wrong side, it will just overwhelm you. So, what I was saying before about what the Hebrews writer had to say, listen to this as to what he says about what he is doing here in this book. He says, we have much to say about this, but it is hard to make it clear to you because you no longer try to understand. In fact, by this time, you ought to be teachers. You need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's word all over again. You need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teaching about righteousness. But solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. Therefore, let us move beyond the elementary teachings about Christ and be taken forward to maturity. Do you see what he's saying? He's saying, what I'm teaching you here, you should have learned in primary school. You should have learned in kindergarten. You should have learned from your parents before you went to school. But you don't know it. I've got to teach it to you all over again. See, this stuff is so foundational in that first century world that Paul didn't even stop to explain it. And nobody else did. And the Hebrews writer who's stopping to explain it says he's explaining it, but it should be absolutely basic to you. You see, so that gives us an insight into a culture that we don't understand. Something's going on here where they thought this was the most elementary of truths, but for us, it seems too hard. This is like, brain surgery or nuclear physics or something. It's way beyond us. But it's not. This is actually very simple teaching, but you have to come to terms with understanding the culture. And remember, in the first century, when they saw the high priest, he was like God. And they did see the high priest, and you couldn't go near him. They saw the ritual, they saw the temples. We don't see any of that. So we're completely disassociated from that world of sacrifices. We completely disassociated from a world where if you commit a sin that can be forgiven, you go and take a sacrifice. We're completely disassociated from a world where if you have bleeding, even if it's a completely natural part of being a woman, for instance, that makes you unclean. And unclean means unholy. Now, that's not a world we understand, is it? It's not a world we understand. That's not our perspective. That is the Old Testament perspective. Do you know Mary gave birth to Jesus, right? Jesus is, of course, the holiest being in existence, ever was, ever will be. Do you know, on the 8th day after that, she had to go and offer the sacrifice that Moses commanded to take away her sin of giving birth to Jesus. The law counted that as a sin, giving birth, because there is an issue of blood. Do you understand that? That's the world we're entering. This is culturally so different. You know, in this world, if you have a disease, if you have a skin problem, you know, I've often had uncontrollable itching on my arms, usually from neck problems, but that would have excluded me from the assembly of God's people, from sores. If you had mildew in your house, has anybody ever had mildew in their house? You were unclean. If you came across a dead animal and touched it, you were unclean. Everything, almost anything it seemed, could make you unclean. Being in the same house with your wife could make you unclean. So all of these things are quite different from our world, and that's part of the world we have to enter in order to understand what's going on. So, this letter being a great challenge, this letter fills a void in our understanding, and that is why we need to understand this foundational teaching. Okay, so what will we learn in this study? We will learn how to do exegesis. So, exegesis, who is familiar with that word? Just show of hands. Not many. If you're familiar with that word. Okay, it's a New Testament study word. Basically means to interpret or draw out the meaning. That's what biblical exegesis is. The opposite of exegesis is to say, here's something in the Bible. What does that mean to you? That's the opposite of exegesis. Exegesis is finding out what it means to the Bible, not what it means to you. In other words, you're not the centre, but we have to find the meaning from within the text itself. So that's what we'll do as we go through this study. It'll help and discipline and train your mind about these things. We'll also learn about the theology of Hebrews. What did the Hebrews believe about Israel? What did he believe about their spiritual condition? Was the nation of Israel saved? Unsaved? Was it impossible to forgive them? Was there something else? What does a Christian look like? These are all things that come out. How do you get to heaven? How do you become perfect? Why do we continue to battle? He does things that, he explains things that we should know, but in a sense we don't. So he goes into great depth there. He also intrigues us, with statements like Jesus having to be made perfect through suffering. And Christians just scratch their head and say, sorry, I don't understand what it means that Jesus had to be made perfect. I always thought he was perfect. Why did Jesus have to be made perfect? Through suffering. These are some of the questions that the Hebrews writer deals with, and he makes it plain. Now, this is just a quote from one theologian. It was just a succinct paragraph to give you a sense of what people have said about it. The difficulty of the epistle. The literary style of the epistle's interwoven material of doctrine and exhortation makes it a difficult document to study. Luther thought it was a disorderly mixture of wood and stubble, gold and silver, not representing apostolic levels of thought. E.F. Scott says it is unable to offer any uniform doctrine. Moffat says the author seems to wander from point to point without any plan or order. So this is the kind of things that people say about Hebrews. And it just, because this is the book that I have studied more than any other book in the New Testament. I did a Masters of Theology at Regent College in Vancouver on this book. And the topic was very unpopular, and I couldn't hardly find anybody who would supervise my work because people just don't like it. So I've always seen this, but once you know what it's like, it's a bit like bone marrow. The thought of it makes you sick, but once you've tried it, you think, oh wow, what have I been missing? And once you start to begin to understand what Hebrews is doing, you really gain a deep, deep appreciation for it. We'll also consider Hebrews as a kind of a guide to preaching. I won't do this too much, but it's important to recognise that it is a sermon and to see how he uses it and where he brings the focus, always back to Jesus, and also a call for us to not turn away from Jesus. That's where his focus is. That's where his focus is. We'll learn how to understand Christianity through that first century Jewish lens, which I think is the biggest thing that's absent from the church today, understanding that. Also, some of the philosophy that was very well known in the first century. In that ancient Greek world, Plato's way of seeing the world was absolutely dominant. And unless you've studied a bit of philosophy at university, you probably don't know much about Plato's view of the world. Something you should know, though, is that these great Greek philosophers, Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, they believed that there was only one God in a world that didn't believe it. I'm not saying they were Christians or Jewish or anything, but their own study came to certain conclusions, and that their beliefs shaped the whole world. Because Alexander went through the whole world, this is how the whole world began to think. And so these ideas permeated everywhere. And if you wanted to teach something, you had to do it against the backdrop of Plato. You had to be Socratic in the way you taught. And so these guys were the thinkers, 3 generations, 1, 2, 3, from the same little place in Greece. And they shaped the whole world and still shape us today, and we're probably not even aware of how. So how are we going to do all this? Well, we're going to do it through these lectures and also discussion. So I want you to stop me at any point if anything's not really clear. I hope I can make things clear. This we actually won't do, and that's why it's in yellow, by exposing ourselves to a range of scholars. So if we were in a classroom environment, I would have 20 or 30 commentaries, Hebrew commentaries, and I would encourage everybody, we'd be looking at verses, and I'd encourage everybody to come and grab 1 or 2 commentaries, and then we all talk about what all the different scholars say about those particular verses, to see what the consensus is saying, to try to get a sense of what's going on. But we can't do that because I've only got 2 commentaries on Hebrews here in Italy at the moment, and I think it would be very hard to find a bunch of other English-speaking commentaries. Well, also, this is a very important part of New Testament study. We'll also be analysing the Old Testament texts in order to evaluate what Hebrews is saying. You know how the New Testament often quotes the Old Testament? And when it does, we usually look at the quote and leave it there. But to understand what's being done, you have to go back to the Old Testament and read that quote in its context. because that brings out the fuller meaning. That brings out the much fuller meaning. And without it, you can get lost. Okay, so I'll give you one example of that. In the New Testament, it says that the Son will be born in Matthew, and you will call him Emmanuel, God with us. Remember that? And then we all sing this, and we think this is wonderful, God with us. Okay, but where this is quoted from Isaiah 7, it talks about this child who would be born called Emmanuel. And by the time this child is an adult, Israel would be destroyed. So it was actually a sign of judgment. This child was a sign of judgment. We might think that it's good and cool to have God with you. But if God coming to you was your judgment day, if that was the day when God was going to look at your homework, it would not be a pleasant thought. And Israel did have a coming judgment day when Yahweh, God, Jehovah God, would come. And when he came, that would be their judgment day. And their books would be open. And the cross is the ultimate fulfillment of Israel's judgment day, the day when the old covenant is terminated and a new one is inaugurated, when Israel is no longer the exclusive people of God, where that covenant is destroyed. You may think, but surely God still has an exclusive relationship with Israel. But he doesn't, you see. Think of it like this. A person can't be monogamous and polygamous. You can't have one wife and many wives. You have one or the other. God had an exclusive contract with Israel. Exclusive. The only way he could bring in all the nations into Israel was to terminate that contract. That had to happen before the Gentiles could come in as equal members with Israel. Up until then, any Gentile who wanted to worship God had to become a Jew. If you were a male, you had to be circumcised, you had to go through rites, you had to, all of that. The only way Gentiles could become Jewish is if that system was shut down. And you'll remember last week I quoted a couple of verses from Paul, that when Jesus died, the law with its ordinances and requirements were nailed to the cross. You see, the commandments, the whole system is terminated when Jesus dies. It dies with him. That's why the second he dies, the curtain is opened. It's torn open. Because the system is finished. The system is finished. Okay, so in order to understand the New Testament, to understand Hebrews, we have to look at what the Old Testament says about these things. Also, we're going to kind of be explorers, kind of like archaeologists, except we're not going to go to any sites, but to investigate the Hebrew story. There's actually tremendous things that are hidden in the Old Testament that are very significant. Do you know, sometimes we're a bit like children, and the big spectacular things catch our attention. So, for instance, there's 2 chapters in Leviticus about skin conditions. Right, it's 13 and 14. A lot of data about just having skin, bad skin, and what you're to do with it. There's some 2 chapters on the garments that Aaron has to wear. Okay? And then there's 3 verses on a fellow named Melchizedek. And the Hebrews writer says, there's God, there's the eternal priest. That's who Christ is. And we would never have noticed it. You would just read over Melchizedek like it was never there. Your eye wouldn't have even caught, you wouldn't have noticed it at all. But the Hebrews writer, that's the critical thing. That's the critical thing. So sometimes the gems are almost hard to see because they're so, you just step over them. You just step over them. And that's so true of significant things in the Bible. We can see it and read it over and over again, but it doesn't catch our attention. It doesn't seem glamorous or significant enough. But this Hebrew writer says, no, this is everything. If you understand that Abraham had a priest. Remember, Abraham is the greatest man in the Old Testament. He's the iconic man. But the Hebrews writer says there's one greater, and that was Melchizedek. Melchizedek blessed Abraham. He blessed him. And straight after he had blessed Abraham, God declared Abraham to be righteous. It's no coincidence. So Abraham had a priest called Melchizedek, and we would never have noticed it unless the Hebrews writer had said, this Melchizedek is so much greater than Abraham. And he's greater than Levi, and he's greater than Moses, and he's greater than all. So things like that. Sometimes the real treasures of the Bible are found in little places. Okay, so this is something that I would normally do with a class, but we can't do it here because I don't think anybody hardly has got a computer. But perhaps we could do this sometime into the program. But if you haven't been introduced to the Step Bible, so stepbible.org. This is from UK. It's a consortium at Cambridge University called Tyndale House. And they've developed this Bible, which is an absolute gem of a tool. So in it, you can get all the different versions you want. So you can pick 10 versions and get them line by line by line by line by line and see how they compare. And also the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Hebrew and the Greek. Now, the wonder of it is that even if you don't know Greek or Hebrew, you can go to this, hit the English word, it shows you which one is then the Hebrew word. You can hit the Hebrew word and you can look at that word every time it's used. And then you get a strong sense of what that word means. And you can do studies and it'll open up the world for you. It's a very, very powerful tool. So let me encourage you to look into it and, get used to it, because for your private study, to see how words are used in multiple places is very important. But it offers Greek tools, it offers commentaries and everything. It's a great tool, and it's free. It's free. Okay, so just tonight, I'm not sure, how are we going, Paul, time-wise? 10 to 9. Okay, so what I want to do is just cover an overview of the meta-narrative using covenants, because Hebrews is really about covenants. And we'll look at that. And then I want to look at a few minor background issues, such as who the author may have been, who the audience may have been, why it was written, and from where it was written, what type of literature it is. You're probably all familiar with the word genre, how that shapes, if you hear a Aesop's fable, you know what it means, and you'll read it within the context of its genre. If you read Shakespeare, you'll read it within the context of its genre. Right? If you hear a politician's speech, you'll hear it in the context of the genre. In other words, he's trying to avoid telling you the truth, but making it look like completely that he is telling you the truth. So, we all understand what genre means. It's a way of communicating a particular style. So what type of genre is Hebrews? The author's worldview, we've already touched on that a little bit, but we'll see more of that. and the contribution that Hebrews makes to our faith in the final analysis. Okay, so I'm going to try to get this to you, and it's not very clear, is it? It's not very clear. But some of you saw this last year when I did some stuff on covenants. I think to understand the Bible, and consequently to understand Hebrews, you've got to understand that there are covenants. And these covenants take different forms. And so on the left side, we've got the covenant and when it was made. And then you see the second line is who the covenant is made with. Right? And the third is the purpose for the covenant. The next one is the sign of the covenant. Right? So not all covenants have sign, but most of them do. And then you have whether there are conditions attached to the covenant. And then you have the mediator of the covenant. That is the person who is in charge of the covenant. And then you have the outcome of the covenant. And then you have the end date of the covenant, when it expires. So, okay, let's play with a covenant that's not up there. Let's look at the marriage covenant. Okay? You know, marriage is a covenant that we make. And it'll be interesting, I want to hear what you think these are. So if we say, okay, marriage is the covenant. Okay, who is the covenant made with?
God and your wife.
Yes, it's made before God, although, of course, not all people accept God in the equation. And remember, marriage is a universal. But what do you think? Who makes the covenant? Who promises who?
The spouses.
Yeah, the husband and the wife are the ones who make the covenant. And they do it in the sight of their community. So that's the essence of it, right? So really, when you say who is the covenant made with, it's for this. Okay, so what then is the purpose of marriage covenant? Come on, some of you, this should be straight. It was only a month ago for some. But what is the purpose? You remember the old Anglican church? There was 3 purposes. Paul, you know them off by heart. And Catherine, do you know them off by heart? The Jane Austen fans should know them off by heart. Every Jane Austen movie has got the pretty much. Katie, do you know them?
I could guess 2 of them.
Okay, go on.
Procreation.
Yeah, to have children.
Yeah, and expression sexuality.
Yeah, as a safe place for sexuality. And what's the other? To find comfort and joy together. So it's a mutual bond for comfort and joy, to be delivered from being ungratified sexually, and also for the procreation of children. They're the basic 3 that you get in an Anglican liturgical service. But you get the idea. In Australia, I don't know in Italy, but what would a marriage covenant in Italy also mean, or in other countries? What about some different countries here? What does a marriage covenant mean there legally?
A union between families. A union between families.
A union between families? Does it have financial ramifications?
No.
right? So what about legal status ramifications? You know, if you're married, then often you can say, well, this person can leave the country with you because you're married to that person, whereas other people can't. So you've got all these extended legal, we don't even begin to recognise if you die, your property and everything goes immediately to that person. It's such a complicated web. So that's purpose. What is the sign that accompanies the marriage covenant? The rings. Yeah, it's usually the rings. But in other cultures, it's other things, isn't it? Any cultures represented here that have something other than rings?
Well, I think in Cameroon they will drink kind of traditional wine.
So there's...
And then it's kola nuts, which are signs that you cannot throw out.
Yeah.
So once you,
Yeah.
I think in Mexico they kind of tie the couple together with very long.
Okay. Yeah, as a sign.
Yeah.
Any others?
In India, they tie a chain around the neck.
Around the neck of both?
No, generally it was tied to the girl like a full, like it's like necklace.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And you've probably seen Jewish weddings. And what do? They break a glass. They shatter the glass. And I think that represents your life. It's over. Like that glass. No. But there's different things that represent the sign. Okay? And I'm just trying to think in we've had this debate in Australia for same-sex marriage and all that for years, and part of the problem was that people understood that marriage was something that happened by the government. Okay, so I've always thought that biblical marriage takes place when there is a consummation. When there's a consummation. So, for instance, when Isaac met Rebecca, was there invitations that went out, or a party, or vows, or anything else? No. He met her, they went into the tent, and they became one. So Paul speaks of this, that the oneness takes place. And Christians have thought that too for hundreds and hundreds of years, that a marriage is not actually confirmed until there's a sexual union between the two. Okay? And this, I hope I don't embarrass anybody here, but this was so powerful in a concept in Israel that on the wedding night, it had to happen at the celebration. Okay, so it was almost like a public event, but not that they did that in public, but they had to do it in a room at the celebration. And then the parents had to go and collect the linen. Is this too much? Too much? If you need to faint or leave the room, you can. The parents collected the linen. And then in the future, if the husband said, that woman wasn't right when I married her, the parents could bring out the linen and say, there's the contract. There's the sign of the marriage. Blood being the sign. Isn't that interesting? Because also blood is a very strong sign for Christians. Now that the blood of Christ is what sets us apart. Anyway, okay, let's continue quickly. So that's the sign. Is there a condition or precondition? Once you're married, is the marriage conditional? Or is it unconditional? Yeah, it's unconditional. The marriage is unconditional. So in a traditional marriage, you say, richer or poorer, sickness and in health, no matter what comes, we are married. Okay? So it's unconditional. So in other words, not if you burn the dinner or if you make me unhappy or, No, once you enter in, it's unconditional, okay? And then if you look at the mediator, it's usually, what Robbie said before was God. Correct. God is kind of like the mediator of it. But for most people, it's also the government, And I'll tell you a story here from 22 years ago. One time I did a wedding for a lady. I won't say where she was from. But anyway, she was marrying an Italian man. And it all went through and they did it in the registry office as you do. And then we had the celebration in the church. And a month later, one of the elders from the community came back and said, her husband wants to know what's going on over here. So she had a husband in another part of the world, and I said, but you said you weren't legally married. She said, I wasn't legally married, but she had a traditional marriage. So it wasn't by the government. So, a lot of parts in the world, you could just have a traditional marriage and it's got nothing to do with the government. But that's still a marriage. Okay, so mediator. Outcome. What is the outcome of marriage? What's the goal? Children is one. A safe environment for children. I mean, anybody, we can all have children, but it's to have a safe, nurturing environment for children.
Would it not be similar to purpose?
Yeah, it is. It is similar. But I think there's something even for a Christian marriage, the goal is always to deliver your partner safely into the hands of Christ. I believe marriages are pastoral relationships. That your job is to shepherd each other. Your job is to nurture each other in the faith. That's the primary objective, to encourage each other in the faith. That's why it's important that Christians marry Christians, because your partner has to be able to encourage your faith. Because when your faith gets low, and I've experienced it, and Catherine's experienced it, your faith gets low and it can really struggle, and then the other partner will pull you through. And if you don't have that, you could be really in a bad spot. Anyway, so that's an outcome. What about the end date? How long are you married for? Till death, all right? So don't listen to pop music. Say, I'll always love you, I'll never love anybody else. They always sort of talk about death for marriage for eternity or love for eternity. No, it ends with the death. It's finished. You can marry somebody straight after the funeral. All right? You're completely free. No. But you can't marry the one who killed your wife. That's one. So anyway, all right, but that just gives you an illustration of how covenants work. And all of these covenants have these same things. So if you look at the sign of these particular covenants, you see the sign with Noah. Do you remember what the sign was of the covenant? The rainbow, remember? The Abrahamic covenant had a sign, and it was circumcision. That would be the eternal sign between us. Then the Mosaic covenant had the Sabbath. On Exodus 31:12 says that Sabbath is the sign of the covenant. The Davidic covenant is one of a throne and a scepter. In other words, pointing to Christ. So you can see that, and then you have conditional and unconditional. and you see the different mediators and that. I'll try to get this printed up so that next week you all have a copy of it as well. Okay, so here's an introduction.
What if I told you that one of the, if not the most important concepts in all of life is also one that is often misunderstood? Maybe like you, when I was growing up, I always was taught that the most important thing in my life was my relationship to God. It makes sense, right? The God of the universe created me, and I need to have a good relationship with Him. What does that mean, though? What does that look like? Is it good if I pray enough during the day? If I go to church every week? We hear things like, I want to be close to God. Well, what does that mean? In short, what does this all-important relationship with God look like? Well, all these questions and more are answered through the biblical understanding of a covenant. The truth is, the understanding of covenant is a comprehensive paradigm. Basically, that means it's something that touches everything in life. But, as I have already said, it is often mischaracterized or misunderstood. Yet, it is the very structure through which we relate to our Creator, and there is not a part of our lives that it does not directly affect. In fact, I will go as far as to say that we can't even fully understand our role in this thing we call life without a good understanding of the covenant. Whether someone acknowledges it or not, every person that has ever lived has one primary relationship in life. It is the relationship with their Creator. That means that it is probably crucial that you and me understand the nature of that relationship. So what does the relationship look like? We will answer that question next.
Okay, so covenant is comprehensive, and there's a lot of areas that in our lives that are covenants, and we're not even probably aware of them. You know, for instance, every one of us has a covenant with the country in which we're living or where we're citizens. You know, if you're a Greek person, or even the child of a Greek person, and you're in Australia, and you go to Greece for a holiday, and you're over 20, they'll pick you up at the airport and take you straight to the army for 2 years' service. That's a covenant you may not even be aware of, but that's a reality. By being that group of part of that group of people, there's a requirement. If you were a Swiss male between the age of 18 and 55, you are in the army, unless you have difficulty walking or something. Okay, so, and we talked a little bit about this last week, that our governors, our presidents, or our kings, or whatever, can make a decision and it directly impacts you. And when you become a citizen, you take vows to keep that covenant. And there's also unwritten covenants, like the covenant you have with your children. Nobody, when your child is born, gives you a covenant and says, here, sign this. You're now responsible to feed, clothe, school, you know. You can go to jail if the child is abused. Nobody gives you that. It's unspoken, but it's nonetheless a real covenant. So there's covenants in operation all around us.
In the first video, we discussed the most important relationship in all of life, our relationship to our Creator. The question is, what is the structure of this relationship? What is the nature of this bond? Is it some magical or mystical connection? I mean, we're finite. He is infinite. So what is the nature of this relationship? Well, it is a legal bond called a covenant. Many of us have heard that a covenant is an agreement between two or more parties. Well, what kind of agreement is it? What does that mean when I am in an agreement with God? Well, let's take a closer look into what this agreement looks like. We will look at 5 components. The first, we will call Transcendence. Now, this component basically answers the question, who has the ultimate authority in this relationship? Someone has to be sovereign in the covenant. Someone sets and governs the terms of the agreement. The second component we will call Hierarchy. The ultimate authority sets in place a chain of command to carry out his authority. Just as every organization needs individuals representing the authority of their superiors, a covenant needs established heads or representatives. The third component is the rules or laws. If I am in this arrangement, what are the terms? What determines whether I'm holding up my end of the deal? What is the required behavior of both parties? Of course, the answer is some form of law. This just makes sense. Next, there are sanctions. What do I mean by sanctions? I mean both positive and negative consequences for keeping or breaking the terms of the agreement. Again, this is intuitive. If I have terms without sanctions, then I may as well not have any terms to begin with. Every legal bond outlines sanctions. Finally, there are provisions that we will call inheritance. This answers the basic question, how does the ultimate authority extend his rule over time? We live in time and space. In a covenant, there are provisions governing the agreement over time. What I have just described is the structure of the relationship between two parties bound together in covenant. It is a legal agreement. But don't let this come across too cold. A covenant is deeply personal. It is intimate. We are personally bound to a personal God and to the others that are in covenant with us. If life is lived in obedience to the terms of the covenant, the relationship is full of life.
It's interesting, I heard today a definition that I never quite grasped, and that is what is organisation? You know, what is structure? Well, the word organisation comes from the word organism. So an organism has to be structured in order to survive. And so covenant is really the structure for life. You know, and it's the same in churches. Like, we can have a loose and cool relationship, but really we've got to have some sort of structure in order to keep the whole organism together. Organisation is necessary for organism to exist. Let's look at the third one.
Our question for today is, what is a conditional covenant versus an unconditional covenant? Throughout the Bible, we find that God deals with man through economies or arrangements called covenants. Two examples of the most prominent covenants are the Old Covenant, which is a conditional covenant or a bilateral covenant, and the New Covenant, which is an unconditional covenant or a unilateral covenant. Under the conditional covenant of the law, God required strict obedience to the law in order for man to obtain righteousness. However, due to man's propensity towards sin and because of man's fallen nature, man was not able to live up to the righteous demands of the law, and therefore the law subsequently failed because it could not provide man the righteousness that it demanded. And so the scripture says that he takes away the first that he may establish the second, which brings us to the New Covenant. While under the law, the key phrase is, if you obey, under the new covenant, the key phrase is, if you believe. The new covenant is a unconditional covenant. It is a unilateral covenant in which God and man come into agreement because God promises to do certain things for man, if man will only believe. In the new covenant, we find that through grace and through faith, we receive the righteousness of God through the finished work of Jesus Christ. The new covenant, therefore, is a better covenant because it is based upon a better sacrifice with better promises. My name is Charles Smoot. Thank you for listening.
Okay, that was Charles Smoot. So that just gives you an introduction to covenants, because Hebrews is essentially about covenants, and we go into it at a little bit of depth. So we didn't quite touch on this, just on the last thing, the condition and precondition. If you look at the new covenant, which is what the Hebrews writing is expressing, the condition or precondition is faith, but not just faith, but enduring faith. So in other words, for the Hebrews writer, what is critical is that you keep the faith. And it's not just the Hebrews writer. Paul says at the end of Timothy, I have run the race, I have kept the faith. The race is to keep the faith. You know, whether you sin, whether you go through devastation, whether you go through poverty, or you become a billionaire, the goal is to keep the faith, and anything that distracts from that should be abandoned. So that's the goal. And what you have in the Hebrews context is a group of people who are getting tired of Jesus. They're not keeping their faith in Jesus. They're starting to turn their attention back to Judaism, back to the temple, back to the sacrifices. They're kind of watering it down. And what they have to do is keep their eyes fixed on Jesus. And that's what gets you there, you see. Okay. How are we going, Paul? I feel like I'm running over. Okay. Look, we'll get through this. We won't actually get to the text. I was hoping we'd start on the first few verses, but we could pick that up next week. So you make that adjustment and the thing as well. Okay, so a brief look at some of the background issues. Author. The author of Hebrews is uncertain. Many people thought it was the Apostle Paul for a long time, but almost nobody believes it is Paul now, and I believe it's convincingly not written by Paul, because Paul uses different language. He uses different expressions. Paul uses words like justification and sanctification. The Hebrews writer uses words like rest for justification, and for sanctification it refers to purification. So he uses different types of words. Paul always announces himself. Every letter he writes, he says, this is me, this is my credentials, this is who I am, this is what I'm up to, this is who you are, this is my relationship with you. Paul really establishes the parameters of his letters. This guy does not. This person also can't be Paul because he refers to the people who first brought the message. He acknowledges that he's not a first-generation Christian, but he acknowledges those who first brought the message. Paul never described himself that way. He always said, I received the message directly from God and brought it to you. He never said he was a second-generation Christian. He was got it directly from Christ. So Paul never used that kind of language. Now, of those who are likely contenders, many names have been presented. Some have even suggested a female author, Priscilla, but there's reasons why that can't be the case, because there are words in there which, when he speaks about himself, he says, I'll explain more of this later. He uses a male gender, so it can't be female. But what we do know about this author is this person is very intelligent. He's really versed in rhetoric, ancient rhetoric. He knows how to make an argument. He knows the scriptures very well. He's completely versed in the Old Testament. This person has a lot of prestige with this community. He's very highly regarded. You know, you can't say to a group of people, you're like children and you need to drink milk. They're not going to listen to you, are they? Unless you're very high up in their estimation. You can only say that if you're a very high person in their perception. And this person is also connected with Paul, but not under the authority of Paul. So, for instance, he's part of Paul's network. At the end, he talks about having, when Timothy gets out of prison, I'm hoping that he'll come with me and we'll come and visit you, things like that. So he's making arrangements to travel, but he's connected with Paul's community. He also, at the end, has a greeting, which is very nice for us here in Italy. He says, those from Italy send their greetings. And some people take that to mean that he wrote it from Italy, but I don't think that's clear at all. I think because there were a lot of all the Christians were sent out of Rome. There was a great dispersion, and they went all over the place. So Priscilla and Aquila were two Romans who actually ended up in Turkey, in what would be Asia then, but modern-day Turkey. And they were those from Italy. They were dispersed everywhere. So the best argument for the author is a person called Apollos, and I thought I had that here. I'll just go through because I don't have it. No. Go back. Okay, Katie, have you got your Bible there? Can you read Acts 18:24 to 19:1? Senza mascherina.
Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Exegesis. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervour and taught about Jesus accurately, though he only knew baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more accurately. When Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him, and he wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. When he arrived, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed. But he vigorously refuted his Jewish opponents in public debate, proving from the scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. While Apollos was at Corinth, Paul took the road through the interior and arrived at Ephesus. There he found some disciples.
Okay, so that's just a snapshot of this man named Apollos. And what we have is an Alexandrian. Alexandria was the seat of learning in the ancient world. Alexandria is in North Africa, and it's on. If you were to ask me what city I want to see, at the top of my list is Alexandria, because of its ancient wonders. It was the home to two of the ancient marvels of the ancient world. What do you call those things? Wonders, yeah, wonders. And it also has all these all this architecture that's sort of sunk into the sea, and it's now a diving museum. So you can go and see these ruins under the sea. But it's also a place where there was a big community of Jews, and it was a cross-section of Greek, Egyptian and Jewish learning. And the library in Alexandria was the best-known library in the world. And it actually was the Google of its day. It got every ancient manuscript. It sought manuscripts from all over the world and had them translated into various languages. So it was actually Alexandria where the Old Testament was translated into Greek. It was a place of great learning. Scholars went there, and very high intellectual community, lots of Jewish people. If you see some of the architecture, if we had more time, I'd show you videos of it to see how the Egyptian mythology and the Hebrew stuff and the Greek world are integrating into the architecture. But it's a fascinating place, and this is a seat of learning. So Apollos is from there. He's discipled by Priscilla and Aquila, who are those from Italy. They say that he speaks so well, he's so bold, he's highly regarded, a man of great intellect. So he really does fit the bill. Plus, he was a sort of a fellow traveller with Paul, even though he wasn't under Paul's direct authority. So he seems to be the most likely candidate, and that's where most scholars now think it was Apollos. Now, the audience, audience is very important because to understand what's being written, you've got to understand who it is being written to. Right? So because this is writing to Jews about the temple and its practices, he's trying to discourage them from going to temple worship. What would that, for instance, tell you about the date of when this was written?
Before 70.
Yeah, before the destruction of the temple. So the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. So if he's encouraging people not to go and to stop honouring that system, it has to be written before that, because it would just look absolutely ridiculous to be doing after it. Yeah? So that's why the audience and the context is so important. But also, because it's a predominantly written to Jews, he says at the very beginning, he says, God spoke to our forefathers. That's how he begins. So it's an in-house Jewish conversation, Hebrews. And he wants, because he's writing to a Jewish audience, you have to think about where the big Jewish communities are. So there was a big Jewish community in Jerusalem, for instance. And if it was sent to Jerusalem, the most likely candidate probably would have been Silas, because Silas was from Jerusalem. If it was written to Alexandria, which is the second biggest Jewish population, it would have been Apollos, because he's the one with that direct connection. So that's how you kind of piece together what's going on. So the audience is likely to be Alexandria. And also the way he speaks of them as being second-generation Christians suggests that he's not writing to Jerusalem, because of course the Christians there heard Jesus directly. They did not receive it from the first generation. See, so things like that help you to put the whole thing together. Provenance of the work, well, that's already kind of mentioned. Where was the origin of the work? That we don't know. He's planning to come to them, so wherever he is, he's not at the destination of his hearers. but probably not too far away. Probably not too far away. But these guys really got around in that ancient world, you know. I was talking to some guys last week, and where Paul actually gives instructions at the end of 2 Timothy to go from where he is, somewhere in Asia Minor, to go up to Troas in Greece, to collect his parchments and his cloak and bring it to him in Rome. Now, these are big distances. You know, you imagine, even today they're big distances. But, I mean, these guys really moved about, you know, and communication was like that too. So we don't know where he was writing from. Some say he was writing from Italy, but I don't think that's convincing. I think he would have been closer, and he was probably with and accompanying people from Italy. The reason for the writing is clearly Jewish people in that community who had started as Christians, had faith in Jesus, who had suffered a lot, but they're over it. They're just over it. It's like coronavirus. You know, yep, we can do this for a month, we can do this for 2, yeah, we can do it for 12. You know, you get to the point you say, that's it, we're rioting, you know. And these people had their stuff confiscated, their possessions were taken, they were losing business. You know, if you have to think about what's going on. If these people are avoiding persecution by becoming Jewish, because that's what's going on, what does that tell you about where they are? What do you think? In Israel, or a place that's predominantly Jewish? Because most of the world, you don't become Jewish to avoid persecution. You stop being Jewish to avoid persecution. You know, my mother's maiden name is Sacco, and I'm pretty convinced now it's a common Italian name, but originally it would have been Isaac. Because there's a Jewish, at the cemetery here in Turin, there's people there buried in the Jewish cemetery called Isako, and they would have dropped the I to avoid persecution. And how many Jews did that? You know, who was Simons, and they changed it to Simmons, or, you know, you got all, you know what I mean. People did it to just avoid the identity because of persecution that came with it. Not many people become Jewish to avoid persecution unless you're in a predominantly Jewish community. So the genre is an interesting one because it's written like a letter at the end, because at the end he's got kind of greetings and personal trivia. But at the beginning it starts like a declaration from God. It starts like Genesis or something like that, you know. In the beginning, you know, God created the heavens and the earth. He says, in the first instance, God spoke to our forefathers in diverse ways. No introduction, no, he just launches in the way so many of the Old Testament scriptures do. But then it ends in this way. So people say that this was a sermon that became penned and circulated. So it was a sermon that became a letter. The author's worldview, I've already touched on this a little bit. He was heavily influenced by Platonism, but also he was thoroughly immersed in the Jewish scriptures, and so he's a Jewish Greek. He's a Hellenized Jew, if you like. And the contribution Hebrews makes to our faith. Well, I think just quickly. If we didn't have Hebrews in the Bible, what would we be missing? I always think when you start studying a book of the Bible, the first question you should say, if this wasn't here, what would we be lacking? Because that helps you to know where that book fits. And so if you look at Hebrews, you could say, well, if we didn't have Hebrews, we clearly wouldn't have a clear understanding that Jesus is our eternal high priest. and we wouldn't have a clear understanding that the Hebrew system, the Jewish Old Testament system, just didn't work. Now, if the system doesn't work and God commanded it to take place, and the Hebrews writer says both those things, then you have a problem. Why? And that's what we answer in Hebrews. Why does God impose a system, an onerous system, a complicated system, but it still achieves nothing? We would not see the Old Testament through Hebrew eyes. We would not understand that Jesus is our great high priest. We would not know that animal sacrifices achieved absolutely nothing. We would not have a clear definition of faith. In Hebrews 11, he gives us a very succinct definition of what faith is. And it's basically seeing those things that are unseen. That's what faith is. We get to see what heaven sees. And we'll see that. He also, we would not have an explanation for why the whole Mosaic administration failed. And we would not clearly know that all Old Testament saints were saved by faith in Jesus. So Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, Rahab, they're all saved because they kept their eyes on Jesus. Wow, what a great insight that is. And that's something we always need to know. So I'm going to end it there.